Um, yeah, if people want to wave their hands and ask questions in the middle, that's okay, because I find it often leads me into an interesting side path, more interesting than what
So,
I was planning on doing. So it's okay.
Linda, can I ask you to be watching in maybe gallery view and watch out for waving hands, because I'm going to have it in speaker view.
Watch out for waving hands.
Watch out for waving hands, absolutely.
Well, that's a good Aikido model, isn't it?
It is. Steve, you're not on mute yet. If you could, that would be appreciated.
I've got to put myself on. Okay.
If you can.
I'll try.
Quentin?
Yes.
Quentin, if I see a hand raised,
Yep.
someone waving madly, should I message you or
if you
speak
wave
up?
at me, I'll know that you've got something to say. So I'll give you some space. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And I may or may not notice, because I may get so absorbed in my own story, being a narcissist. I think my narcissism is on the less strong side, given our past president. So let me start. My name is Bob Frager. I began Aikido in 1964 in Hawaii, where I was studying Japanese full-time. Before that, I had studied with two wonderful teachers. I'd studied Judo with a man named Hal. I'm having a senior moment now. Hal Sharp, who had studied at the Kodokan, and he was actually the leading foreign Judo student. He was the head of the foreign Judo team, or whatever they called it. Wonderful, wonderful man. And I also studied karate with Ed Parker, who was one of the very first karate instructors in the United States. He was famous for introducing Bruce Lee to the world. He put on every year some large karate tournament in LA. And I studied personally with Hal and Ed. So I kind of knew how to take a fall and throw a punch, at least enough to get me in trouble when I finally made it to Tokyo.
So what made you go to Tokyo? What was the inspiration for that?
You didn't wave your hand, but that's just fine, because you don't have to mute, Quentin.
No, I'm the only guy that won't be waving hands. I'll just interrupt.
Okay, that's okay. I was inspired by Judo. I started Judo back in 1957 when I was a freshman in college. And, I'd read all those wonderful stories about Zen and the art of archery, and how you can really learn the depths of Japanese culture by doing a Japanese art or discipline. And Hal said to me, because I was a fairly serious Judo student, Hal said, Bob, if you really want to study Judo more deeply, my old Judo teachers are still around, and I'm sure one of them would put you up if you wanted to go for the summer or longer, and you could train every day at the Kodokan. And that planted a seed that was, oh my God, I could go, and I wouldn't have to sleep in the street. So it really came from that. And I applied for various fellowships, none of which I got because I couldn't articulate. I couldn't say I want to do Judo to, academic fellowship granters. They had no idea that the body was an important organ. It was all the brain. And I finally did. I ended up with a fellowship from the East-West Center in Hawaii. And it included a year studying Japanese at the University of Hawaii, and then a year in Japan. So there I was at the university, and I finished 2 years of spoken Japanese, conversational Japanese, and 2 years of reading and writing in 1 year. They were both double courses. So I had Japanese literally coming out my ears. And a friend of mine who was a student of karate, one day loaned me his book on Aikido. And I think it was called This is Aikido by Koichi Tohei. First time I saw a picture of O-sensei, something responded inside me. And when I read, there was a little section called Memoirs of the Master, or Memoir of the Master. And again, something opened up inside me in response to that. And I said, this is what I've been waiting for. This is what I really want to study. The interesting thing is I thought of this weird little cartoon that was an ad for bodybuilding. I forget who the bodybuilder at the time was. He was famous. And it was this cartoon of a skinny guy with a cute girl going to the beach and a bully stepping up and kicking sand in his face. I'm not sure many of you remember these. And the next panel, he goes off, gets this course, buys weights, and is busy pumping himself up. And then he goes back to the beach and kicks and beats up the bully. And I thought, yeah, that's what it is. That's the only alternatives in this weird culture of mine. You're either a bully or a victim. And Aikido is the way out. And I got that from seeing O-sensei, reading his, short sayings and poems, and I knew I had to study it. So there was this instant affinity. And it turned out the main dojo in Hawaii was about a 10-minute drive from campus where I was living. And I started Aikido. It was in the summer. It was in the probably the very beginning of 1964.
Right.
And I would train beginners classes a couple of times a week. And I mentioned to one of my teachers, who's a Japanese Hawaiian, actually Japanese American, I'm going to Japan. I have a fellowship and it's almost over. I'm going to go to Japan. And the next thing I knew, a few days later, the chief instructor in Hawaii, Yamamoto Sensei, Yamamoto Yukiso, I believe, had been a very famous judoka and judo teacher. He met O-sensei and he was just enthralled and mystified by O-sensei's Aikido. And he brought me into his little office and he started chatting with me. He said, "You're going to Japan. Are you going to train?" He said, "Yes, of course, I'm going to train at Hombu Dojo." And he took out this beautiful piece of rice paper with, still remember it. It was the fancy rice paper that had silk threads going through it. He started making ink. You take an ink stone and a solid piece of ink and water. And so as we're talking, he's making ink and he gets out a brush and he starts with beautiful brush strokes, writing me a letter of introduction to O-sensei. I was much too stupid to know that was a good idea. I mean, what did I know? I'm a foreigner with, equivalent of 2 years of spoken Japanese. So he gave me this letter. It's very sweet. And he said, "Train hard. You're representing Hawaii." And I immediately got a sense of this was another world. I wasn't just representing me, like a good individualistic American. So he said, "You're representing us and train hard and train well." My first day in Tokyo, I took my letter, made my way to Hombu Dojo. And I went in. It was the old dojo, not the new concrete one. And I handed it to the gentleman who ran the office. And I said, "This is a letter from Yamamoto Sensei in Hawaii for O-sensei." And he said, "Oh, thank you." And then he disappeared. I mean, he really didn't say anything. He just disappeared. And I'm standing there, in the area that you stand in to take your shoes off before you enter a house or a building. And it seemed like I waited for an hour, but it was probably only 10 minutes. And he said, come in. And so I took my shoes off. I came in and he ushered me into a little room in back of the office. And there was O-sensei and Kishomaru sensei, or Nidai Doshu. And we chatted a little bit, and I stammered in my horrible schoolboy Japanese how honored I was to meet O-sensei, and blah, blah, you know. And finally, they took pity on me, and Kishomaru sensei took me out, showed me where I could change, and he said, the next class is at 3 o'clock, and you can change now and warm up. And that was my first meeting with O-sensei. I believe I said I dreamed about O-sensei, and he nodded as though it wasn't unexpected. It was a good thing that we're supposed to have that sort of intangible connection with him. And I started training every day, 7 days a week, for the next 2 years. My Japanese got better quickly because I was surrounded by it. And I was also I was enrolled in Keio University, which is a famous one cut below Tokyo University. And at a certain point, I was translating for someone who had questions of O-sensei. And I finally said, O-sensei, could I take ukemi for you? Because I would like to experience your Aikido. And I mean, I was like a bull in a china shop in Japan. I violated subtleties of Japanese etiquette and culture every day. And so there was this dead silence. I mean, O-sensei was silent, like it was like a lead weight dropping. And he didn't say anything. And I thought, okay, Bob, you did it again. Nothing was said. And I certainly didn't raise it again. But what was fascinating was as soon as I got my Shodan a couple of months later, he started using me as uke all the time. I mean, not his only uke, but when he would come out and demonstrate, I was probably beside the teacher at the moment, or the uchideshi, he chose me. So I thought, oh yeah, this is a new definition of black belt. You're at least good enough to take ukemi. Or let me add, to take ukemi from O-sensei, which is not quite the same. And taking ukemi from O-sensei, it was absolutely unlike anything I experienced before or since. My sort of felt experience was I would come in with a grab or with a shomen cut, and he never told you, by the way, how he wanted you to attack. You had to read it from his body. So I always said, oh, please, God, let me attack the way he wants, because he'll probably throw me how he wants, which might be difficult from the wrong attack. And I would line up, I would cut, and it felt as though I did this, that I inexplicably spun to the side and gave a really terrible attack. Like I took a dive for O-sensei. And I would correct and say, I love O-sensei. I have the greatest respect for him. I love him as a human being, as an Aikido master. Why the hell am I tanking? Why, and I would try not to do that again. And I felt I did it again. Now, for everybody else, he didn't just stand there and they swerved to the side. He would move. And he would generally be beside them even before they hardly raised their hand. And so I said, wait a minute, maybe he's doing that with me, but he's doing it so well, I don't even know it. And I noticed people that were new to taking falls for him got up the way I did, which is, what happened? So after a while, he took pity on me because I still looked as dumbfounded. And he sat me down in front of him and he said, put out your hands. I thought, oh, we're going to do Kokyu Dosa. So I put my hands out, and then he put his hand over both my wrists. Very soft, lovely touch. And he said, push. And I pushed, and that soft, lovely touch didn't change. And I didn't go anywhere. It was like a feather that I couldn't move. And he smiled at me, and I had the sense that what he was saying was, look, you can't figure out what I'm doing when we're sitting, not moving. Of course, when you're attacking me, you don't know what happened. I mean, that was the gloss that I gave to that experience. But it reminded me that, you know, Aikido is far more sophisticated, far more subtle, far more interesting than we usually think it is. Because the Aikido we do with each other isn't that. We're not capable of doing O-sensei's Aikido. And I remember some of the Uchideshi who became teachers in their own right would say the same thing. They would say, look, O-sensei, there was one master of Aikido, and all the rest of us are trying to figure out what he did. So that was my...
So I remember talking to Bob Nadeau and him telling me that you know, he would ask questions, which of course was not the done thing, but actually O-sensei used to quite like it. What about for you? Did you ask questions, and because you were a sort of ignorant Westerner, get away with it and glean all the information that others were dared not ask about?
Well, somewhat, although, you know, the people in the dojo would try to protect O-sensei from us foreigners, because the Japanese wouldn't bother him, especially those without rank. No, and I'm grateful to Nadeau because I was the guy who translated a fair amount of the time. So that's how I got in. It was translating for Nadeau is when I asked O-sensei, could I take ukemi for him? But a couple of years later, I had returned to Japan as a research fellow, and I was doing research at Keio University, but my time was flexible, and somehow I heard, this was a weird grapevine at Hombu Dojo, I heard that O-sensei was off to Iwama, and there was nobody to accompany him, and so I said, I'll do it. My Japanese was very good by then. I mean, I really could, you know, translate back and forth and dreamed in Japanese once in a while. And the Japanese went, what? And I said, yeah, I can, you know, adjust my time. I'll go with him to Iwama and stay there with O-sensei. And they reluctantly agreed. And Nakazono's son, I think his name was Jilao or Jiro Nakazono. His son was about 12 or 13. They sent him with me because at least he was Japanese, they could trust him. So he came with me at O-sensei, and we spent about 3 or 4 days in Iwama. And that was priceless. I mean, I got to sit with O-sensei. I watched television with O-sensei, which is a very strange experience. He showed me a scrapbook about his trip to Hawaii, which was really a high point for him. He was very happy. There's a beautiful I forget the wood it was made of. It was made of some wood from Hawaii. There was a little table in front of us, and they gave it to O-sensei. They shipped it for him, and he was just very happy with all those things. He also, in his little room in Iwama, it was filled with books. I mean, very few people probably realize how much he read. And this is another one of my half a dozen or so O-sensei stories. So eventually the trip is over. I went around with him every morning right at sunup, and he would pray at like 4 or 5 Shinto shrines around the property. So there's a Shinto shrine in the dojo. Then we went outside. There's a Shinto shrine in the middle of the sort of garden / farm in back. And he would chant the Norito and other things. And I would stand in back of him going, But then at least once or twice, I got to take some pictures of him doing the chanting. And that's one of my most treasured souvenirs. And then we went to the Aikido shrine itself and prayed there. And he did that every morning. That was part of his life.
So you got to see him off the mat. So everybody knows he was a bit of a legend on the mat, but how did you find him as a man?
He was I was in love with him. I mean, he was really a sweetheart. Now, he did have a bit of a temper, but luckily I didn't usually engage it, except the one time I said, could I take faults for you? It was the dojo and his house, which was literally adjoining the dojo. It was very simple and very primitive. There was an outhouse, no flush toilets. There was a young woman whose family lived in the Iwama area, and she was their full-time sort of maid and assistant and cook, because O-sensei and his wife were, I think, in their 80s by then. And she would get up even before us when it was still dark out, or she would come over from her house, and she would make a wood fire under the ofuro, and it would take all day to heat up. We couldn't get into it. It would, until late afternoon, early evening. And she would do the same thing with the rice pot. So the rice would start cooking under a wood fire. So this was all very, very simple and lovely. And I, slept in the room next to the dojo, which was because a lot of groups would come and train at Iwama. So there was like a little dormitory, Japanese version of a dormitory, which is you slept literally side by side, covered the floor. So it's time to go back, and I had very little luggage, neither did O-sensei. So I was, I went with him, and we got on a train, and it's about a 2-hour ride in those days. It's down to an hour now. And we're standing, and someone gets up for O-sensei because he was very distinguished looking, and he sat down next to a lady who was in her probably late 70s. And he was sort of trying to make conversation with her. He would say, I am Ueshiba of Aikido. And she would go, that's nice. What's an Aikido? She had no idea. As the average Japanese probably didn't know much about martial arts, didn't know about Aikido. And he kept trying. Aikido is a way of reconciling the world. Didn't go anywhere. And then he finally thought, and he pointed at me and he said, this is my student, Bob. This is my deshi, my disciple, Bob. He has a PhD from Harvard in psychology. Isn't that nice? And she said, oh, that's very nice, because all Japanese knew about Harvard because of Kennedy. That was the University of Kennedy. And I was thinking, oh my God, I was so embarrassed. It's like, who am I for O-sensei to talk about me? I mean, he's O-sensei and I'm sort of nothing. And my love for O-sensei was not for his Aikido. It was like his Aikido came out of who he was, and that was what was important. That somehow, and it's hard to find the words, even though I've had a long career in trying to find those words, he was developed as a human being.
Yeah.
He was what Abe Maslow would have called a self-actualizing person, which doesn't tell you anything, it's just jargon. But
So,
he was, yeah.
It's really, really important to me, and I think for the audience we have today, So for Sensei, that was the main purpose of Aikido, to develop self and become a better human being.
Yeah, absolutely. He said a number of interesting things. One thing he said to me was, you know, Sensei's the practice of Aikido is to develop both spirit and body. The physical practice of Aikido is only for the body. Which is interesting because he's really saying there's got to be something else. Aikido is not just a physical practice. Now he didn't say what that other practice was, but obviously it was. He said many times. He said, "Look, it's the practice of the fundamental principles of all religion. It's the practice of universal kind of spirituality, no matter what particular tradition you're of religious or spiritual tradition you're in." Which is interesting because I promptly sort of one by one went through almost all of them, trying to figure something out. But it was like there was this deep humility, Sensei, that people don't get. He was wanted to entertain the lady. There was a 2-hour train ride, and he wanted to make conversation. And if Aikido didn't make any sense, he could say something about me.
Yeah,
But
so he doesn't sound like he was really into hierarchy.
well, he didn't care a lot for hierarchy. I mean, I remember one of his old students came by and he was sort of hinting he wanted more rank. He said, "What do you want? You want 6 dan? I'll give you 6 dan." It's just, he really was beyond that. And as you probably know, he's giving 10th dan to Hikizuchi Sensei, and Abe Sensei from Osaka drove the sort of bureaucrats at Hombu crazy. And they made a big fuss at the time, and then afterwards they were careful to explain, but it wasn't a Hombu stamped 10th dan. It was only in Sensei's handwriting.
Oh,
and I
yeah.
thought, I know. It's like, you guys sort of missed the point, don't you?
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But everywhere you have bureaucrats everywhere. I ended up after Sensei passed as a student of Kato Hiroshi Sensei, who not all of you may know, but when I was training in the 60s, he was the most feared man on the mat who was not instructing. And he said to me, there was some question about whether I would get my next promotion. He said to me, "They're not going to make too much trouble, Bob. Everybody in the office is afraid of me." So
why did you choose him? I mean, there were many famous names, and you're right. I doubt anybody knows that name here. And he was a kind of a fierce warrior, if you like. Why did you choose him?
He was a paradox. I mean, he was fierce. When I trained with him in the 60s, I was introduced by a friend of mine, an Aikido friend of mine, who had been in Uchideshi. And he was just so much better than everybody else who was training. And when I had trained in Shingu, I mean, all day, every day with Hikizuchi Sensei, 10th dan, Ano Sensei, 7th dan, 2 of the other Shihan who were 6th dan each. And I often trained with them personally, not just leading the class. And I returned to Hombu Dojo and I noticed that the practice at Hombu was not nearly as martial, was not nearly as focused on detail as what I learned in Shingu. And then I trained with Kato Sensei. I said, "Kato Sensei, I haven't seen you in a long time." And he I think he remembered me because my Japanese was really a lot better than virtually any foreigner there. And we trained together, and it was like I felt like someone cast a bad spell on me, and I turned into my grandmother who was sick. Nothing worked. I mean, I could chin myself, do ikkyo, and I could chin myself on his arm. It didn't, he didn't care about it. And eventually he came over here, and Linda Holliday again invited him to teach at her dojo, and Jimmy Friedman, who teaches in San Francisco, invited him, and they both invited all their colleagues and friends to train. And I realized, and this was, again, some years later, this was probably late 70s by now, that he was the best teacher of Aikido I'd ever had. I mean, he would break things down. He was also, he was incredibly strong, both physically, but also there was an amazing extension of ki that he would use anytime. It felt like you were riding on a sort of a laser beam into the mat. And along with that was a deep love of O-sensei that we shared. And he was totally aware that he and I were one of the few left who really loved O-sensei in this profound way.
That's sad to hear.
And he had great depth and understanding. Two of my students were concerned that some of the people going up for black belt really weren't as good as they were. And so they asked Kato Sensei, what is it? What do you have to know to be a Shodan? And he said, to be a Shodan is to be dedicated to the ideals of Aikido. This is from this guy who's, everybody at Hombu is afraid of, except for the most senior guys who are sort of on a par with him. But, he said, you train to be strong. And they said, well, what do you mean to be strong? How do you bounce people around? He said, no, being strong is, to live life according to your ideals. It was nothing about being strong martially. And even what he said to me was interesting. He said, Bob, you and I are O-sensei's shinja, which is not a term I'd heard in any other context. Deshi is normal for disciple. Shinja is more like disciple in the sense of a spiritual disciple. I mean, Shin as in Shinto. That we were O-sensei's disciple, but in the sense that we followed him as our teacher or guide or whatever in that other part of Aikido that wasn't the physical but was the spiritual. Well, so that's why I stayed with him for 20 years.
Sounds like a good question. A question's come up on the chat, which I think is worth arguing. You talked about the ideals of Aikido. Would you like to say what you believe the ideals of Aikido were from O-sensei's perspective?
Sure. Well, if I talk about, I was thinking about talking about the floating bridge of heaven. And, in O-sensei's book, translated by John Stevens, The Secret Teachings of Aikido, O-sensei said some fascinating things. He said the floating bridge of heaven symbolizes an enlightened state of being. A person who speaks and acts truly is always standing on the floating bridge. And he said, if you don't stand on the floating bridge, it's interesting, then Aikido will not come forth. We should recreate the world each time we practice Aikido. That's one of the ideals. Sensei would say things and then we go, I don't know what in the world do you mean by that? So he would go to these quite extraordinary sayings, recreate the world whenever we do Aikido. And, I think Paul and I were very lucky to study with Moshe Feldenkrais, and Feldenkrais would hint at things like that. that, you know, with every movement, you sort of recreate yourself and recreate the world. And the problem was there was this gap between, you know, these extraordinary spiritual ideals and the physical art that most people were interested in. And historically, I think that's due to the fact that his teacher, Onisaburo Deguchi, was almost persona non grata everywhere in Japan. He was thrown in jail. He was accused of being a traitor to Japan because he said, war, we should all make peace. War is not a proper activity for human beings. You shouldn't kill people. This was like pre-World War II Japan, when the military totally controlled the country. Deguchi was an amazing teacher. He also said, we need to change Shinto because Amaterasu is the sun goddess, the divine principle of the sun, for the Japanese people. He said, we can't have a religion just for the Japanese people. It has to be for everyone. And so he proposed another divinity for all humanity. Well, that made all the Shinto people just furious. And at one point, they were persecuting and throwing in jail everybody that followed Deguchi. Sensei was one of his most prominent followers. They took down all his scrolls. The dojo, Hongu Dojo, was filled with calligraphy by Deguchi, who was a brilliant calligrapher. And they took them down. I think even burned them because they were afraid that the police would come and close the dojo and throw Sensei and maybe everybody else in jail.
So there are two things that come out of that. One, that sort of Aikido is all about peace. So Sensei took that from Deguchi. And two, that it's for everybody. So, let's not think about individual religions. Let's think about a way that unites us all. So I wonder if there are any other ideals that you'd like to talk about, but also you've had a little bit of time to reflect on what Sensei said. And I remember my teacher saying to me, sometimes I'm talking to you for tomorrow, not for today. And years later, you kind of think, oh, that's what he meant. Have you had those moments?
Yeah, well, recently I have, again, with the rioting in Washington, D.C., I was shocked, as all of us, I think, were. And like someone who's spent all my life in the university, I went back to what Freud had to write about the death instinct and the instinct toward death and destruction. And Freud's disciples loved him and were fanatic about his teachings, but they forgot this one. They would say, Freud went too far. Let's just stay with love and sex and frustration. And I won't get into details because I think Freud it was sort of distorted because of Freud's insistence that everything was based on biology. We could understand human beings only through biology. But if you take the notion that each of us has a tendency toward destruction and a tendency toward love and creativity. They're tendencies, they're in every human being. And I just got this sudden aha moment that's why Aikido is so damn important. What other discipline can help you, cope with the drives toward destruction in yourself and other people and nourish the drive toward love and harmony? And there's a wonderful old legend. An old Native American warrior was saying to his grandson, my son, everyone has two wolves within themselves. There's a wolf of anger, fear, destruction, hate. And there's also a wolf of love and caring and compassion. And the grandson looks up at his grandfather and says, "Grandpa, which one wins?" And his grandfather said, "Whichever one you feed." And I love that. I mean, I love the simplicity of it. Makes me a bad professor because I don't love unnecessary complexity. Aikido teaches us to feed that in us, which is about love and compassion, and to control the tendency in us toward violence.
Mm.
You know, if you don't have somebody punching at your face, how are you going to learn to deal with that tendency toward violence?
Mm. So are you frustrated, like I must admit I am, about the direction that a lot of the Aikido world has taken then?
Well, again, that's, you know, that is such a huge question in the Aikido world. How do you balance the Budo, the martial aspect, with this aspect of spiritual transformation? And let me go back to the floating bridge, if I will. By the way, we have till 12, or can we go over time?
Well, what we'll do is we'll go to about 12,
Okay.
and then I'm going to open it up for questions for other
Okay,
people to ask you, if that's okay.
Okay.
And if it's, I'm going to say it now, I suspect you may have a bit more to tell us than what you will have done by 8. So if you'd like to come back again, we'd love to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Sure. I mean, talking about Aikido is one of my very favorite things. Not quite as good as doing Aikido, but, you know, since I can
We quite like listening about
do
it.
Aikido, I'll talk.
You were back at the floating bridge.
And I spent some time reading about the floating bridge, and I've done some talks on it. Literally, the term is Amen no Ukihashi, which is the floating bridge of heaven. Hashi is bridge, ukeru is to float, just like ukemi in a way. It's a place that's neither here nor there. It's floating. It's sort of, they say it's between heaven and earth, but that's implicit. It's not in the title. Osensei said, by the way, it is where takemusu comes from. That when you're standing on the floating bridge in this space between, then the techniques of Aikido are born. Because if you're solidly planted somewhere, you're going to do what comes out of where you're planted. And I could talk about that, but the legend goes, and this is from the Kojiki, which Osensei dearly loved, that this great god and goddess, brother and sister god and goddess, were given the task of creating the material world, and they were handed by the older kami a heavenly spear, jeweled, just to make it classy. And they stood together on the floating bridge. They grasped this spear. They stirred the sort of unformed stuff of heaven, created a vortex. The salt, the drops of salt water, and I won't go back to being Freudian because that's just too damn obvious, came down to the unformed plane below the floating bridge and turned into, guess what, the islands of Japan. Because if you're going to have a creation myth, it's got to start with you. So the floating bridge is the place where physical creation starts. It's a place of creation. It's the yin and yang, masculine and feminine, brother and sister, holding it together, the spear. And Osensei would always do this movement before he started Aikido, always, every time I saw him do it, which nobody talks about because nobody understands it. By the way, Kato Sensei's staff work starts with this. His mother was in Omotokyo, the same spiritual tradition. So anyhow, you bring down this unformed stuff of heaven, it turns into what eventually becomes the physical universe. But I think it's it's clearly a threshold or alignment. Liminal really means something that is between somehow. I would suggest places that you do your spiritual and personal development practice are all liminal places. You don't do prayer in the middle of the street. You don't do prayer sitting at a bus stop with all, I mean, you can if you've got nothing else to do, but basically you want to find a quiet, lovely space to do your spiritual work. The dojo is a liminal place. Why do we bow before we go in the dojo? Well, it's because the Japanese do. No. I mean, yes, it is because nobody talks, but you bow to remind yourself you're stepping into a place that's different from the rest of the places in your life that you engage with the world and don't do spiritual practice. So you honor that place. That's why there's a shomen. In many Japanese dojos, the shomen actually has a Shinto shrine in it. So I think it's a very important place, and the notion that we make our dojos sacred spaces is a huge step in the direction of trying to figure out how we can nourish ourselves and our students spiritually.
So let me pull you back to the fact that a lot of people in the Aikido world just don't have that aspect in their training. It's just, and they have no interest in the spiritual side of things. It is purely just the martial technique. Well,
that's very nice for them. I can't tell them what to do or not to do, but I think they should go do something else. Or not call it Aikido.
Yeah, okay. I'm with you on that one.
But there are people in Marin County. I always make jokes about Marin, where people sit in hot tubs and have high thoughts in both senses of the word. You can't do Aikido like you're dancing with daisies in your hair and go, ooh, that's not Aikido either.
Yep.
You can fall off the tightrope either way. And so there's this amazing paradox. How do we, and it's like in the yoga tradition, for example, yoga is really based on the notion of friction. You do things that are difficult and you build up willpower and you build up what we would say is ki, and they would say is prana of a certain kind, but it needs friction to do it. And old yoga was filled with, really difficult practices, like holding a yoga pose for an hour, which makes you want to die if you can't move. So I think that friction between these two things may be necessary.
Yeah.
I think racing to solve it is a mistake because we're not smart enough. I'm not smart enough to solve that issue. I may have moments where I think I've solved it, and then I wake up. But let me say some other things. First of all, the floating bridge means if the bridge is floating, it's not a place for physical power. You've got to be relaxed, because you try using physical power on something that floats, you're going to fall off, or you'll tip the floating bridge like you're on a floating raft. And one of the most extraordinary Aikido senior students that has ever been my pleasure to meet. Nobody knows. He was an old friend of Kato Sensei. And my son, who's an Aikido teacher, went back several times to Japan to study with him. He doesn't have a dojo. He rarely teaches. But he would visit him in at his home. His name is Kubadera Sensei. And he would go every morning and clean the local Shinto shrine. You know, that was the first thing he did every day. And he would keep saying to Eddie, they would train together. He would just keep saying, relax, you have to learn to relax. You know, move without tension. He could do all these extraordinary things because he had no tension. By the way, as an interesting commentary, he started Aikido in the early 50s before Kato Sensei did. And you have almost nobody has any idea how tough Aikido was back then. People got hurt regularly. So Kubadera's first day, he got on the mat, and I forget one of the one of the guys who was an Uchideshi, I think, put Nikyo on him and almost broke his wrist. And it was Tada Sensei, threw him into a wall and banged his shoulder up. And so he bowed and left. He said, I'm not ready to do Aikido. And so he started training in Iai and Tameshigiri, using, cutting bamboo. And he got so good, and this was one of the old timers in Japan, said Kubadera Sensei, when he was cutting bamboo, before the first piece of bamboo hit the ground, he'd cut the second one. He developed wrists and a body that could move, and then he went back to do Aikido, and he didn't get hurt. Kato Sensei, I mean, again, he was 15, I think, when he studied Aikido, and he only got in because his mother was in the same tradition as Sensei. I mean, some other kid the same age came to start training, and Kato Sensei broke his arm. And his mother took him by the ear over to the boy's house and made him apologize. But there's a craziness about that. I mean, but where, how do we balance it? How do we figure that out? I've noticed, for example, if you look at pictures of O-sensei, and everybody thinks O-sensei does this for Riminage. Well, he did some of the time. He didn't even go down. He would just extend up. But very often he would do Riminage this way. Go right into the guy's throat. There are some where he's got a fan, and the fan is in the man's throat. Other time it's the hand. Arakawa Sensei, who was, again, one of the best known senior teachers at Hombu, would look around like this. He wouldn't seem too focused, and you'd think martial arts have to be focused. He didn't. He just had soft eyes. He looked around. And then it took me a while to notice that when he threw somebody down, they would start choking while he was looking around the dojo, because he wasn't looking at them, but his hand was here. And he was one of the best. I mean, he was one of the most martial of the instructors at Hombu. And yet people say, well, does Aikido work? You're damn right it does if you have your hand in somebody's throat. Another one of my teachers from Shingu, Tojima Sensei, said the same thing, and actually would demonstrate. He moved so fast I couldn't see his hands move sometimes. And he said, you don't say anything, you don't take a martial stance, you just go here. And you ride them all the way down and keep your hand on their throat until they tap out or drop whatever they're holding in their hand or whatever. But it's an amazing paradox. And I mean, there was a time I would go too far to the other side of its peace and love and all that lovely thing. And my Sufi master, who's a wonderful Turkish Sufi master, in a culture that loves warriors, looked at me at one point. He said, the aim of a martial art is to be able to instantly stop someone who's engaged in violence, to be able to protect the weak and to be able to do it instantly. And I got it. I said, that's what that side is for. That's the context in which we should hold that side, even though it's not a final answer. But the other question is, how then do we do the other side? And Kato Sensei would chant the Norito when he would first come into any dojo. It was a critical piece of his Aikido practice, but that's not for us. I mean, I was never drawn to Shinto as my spiritual practice. So, I would think one important start is to think about the dojo as a spiritual space, as a space in which, and this is a sort of a quote from Feldenkrais, it's a space in which spiritual development can occur. The original quote, it's amazing how much I remember of, what I learned from him in 2 summers a million years ago. He said, teachers are garbage. Teachers just stuff you full of stuff that they know. But an educator, a real educator, is priceless. An educator is someone who creates the space in which real learning can occur. And it's, he didn't say he makes you learn or she makes you learn. A space in which learning can occur depending on the interaction of you and the teacher and what's being taught, etc. So
that sounds like a subject for a whole session, actually. What makes for a great educator? How do we create that environment? Because I think it's an interesting difference, the difference between an educator and a teacher and a coach. I think most of us are a little bit of each, depending on what's required at the time. But it would be an interesting subject to explore. We have just about hit 8 o'clock, and I do want to give people the opportunity to ask some questions.
Sure.
So guys and girls, this is a good time to unmute. And who any volunteers basically for a question?
Oh, the quote to David, the quote is from Moshe, from Feldenkrais. Yeah.
Okay. Andrew, have you got a question?
I was interested in the concept of the floating bridge. I've heard it described as the meeting of the 2 forces of gravity and the spinning of the earth. How do you think about that?
Well, that's somebody in their head. The Shinto scriptures don't mention gravity, not directly. The floating bridge is a place of creativity. I think that's number one. The most obvious one is this wonderful stir up the stuff of heavens, bring the spear down, and these drops of salt water create. There's a particular island, I can't remember the name now, that's the first of the islands around Japan. But the interesting thing is there's a big pillar in the middle of the floating bridge. It's again a very Freudian sort of story. And they walk around the pillar and they look at each other, and each one says, "Oh my God, you're built differently from me. You've got something dangling down and under your hara, and you have an opening under yours." And they experiment. They basically engage in sexual relations, and she gives birth. So it moves from being a place of physical creativity to create biological creativity that I believe populates the earth. That I'm not totally so clear on, but that's I think that's a very important piece of this story. Now, there wasn't gravity because the physical creation didn't occur until early story. So the floating bridge is up there with no gravity because there's no physical universe, if you believe the story. There's heaven is even unformed. There, the kami, the gods and goddesses, the divine characters are there, but not gravity. I would say gravity. You need physical stuff.
Steve, I know that you had a question before we even came on the session. Do you want to ask it now?
Yes. If what would the founders' attitude toward disability, or if a blind person like myself wanted to learn Aikido, would he sanction that?
Huh. My guess is he would. I mean, I've had some students with disabilities, and it was always a wonderful challenge to work with them. So, I mean, I never heard Sensei say anything about disabilities. And Japanese tend not to want to deal openly with disabilities. It's just in the culture to ignore it, as it has been in ours. So I really never heard him mention anything, nor do I recall anybody at Hombu Dojo or any of the other dojos I trained in Japan with a disability.
But I think even today, these days, I still think people with disability are not taken as seriously as they should be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I did have one blind student when I was teaching at UC Santa Cruz way back. And I mean, at one point, you know, he went around with a white cane, and he was very gifted. He was like he had a radio program, loved music. And he was in line one day holding his white cane, and somebody cut in front of him, you know, who was kind of an idiot. And he hooked, you know, the cane had a little strap on it. He hooked the strap around his wrist. He grabbed the man's arm and put Nikkyo on him. It was either, no, I'm sorry. It was Nikkyo or Sankyo. And he moved them out of the line. He said, go to the back of the line. The whole line cheered. It was just a wonderful moment for him, for sure. I've had some other students who've talked about how incredibly empowered they were by Aikido because they were doing things they didn't think they could do. I had one student whose body was really in very bad shape. They'd been in the hospital for quite a long time from a very bad car accident. And they were a graduate student in psychology, but I made everybody do Aikido. And at one point I was requiring people to do like a 3-person group, 2 attackers. And he told me later it petrified him. But when he pulled it off, he said, that was one of the most important moments in my life. You know, that I realized I didn't have to think that I was lesser than I had been. I have a more recent student with a wooden leg. He lost his right leg in a motorcycle accident years and years ago, and he just got his knee done. He never thought he would make it to Shodan. And you on the mat, you would never think he had a prosthetic.
Can I just widen that question a little bit? So I guess disability is just one area of difference. And perhaps more realistic in Sensei's time was the fact that there were a few women who practiced, but it wasn't common. At least that would be my perception. How did he treat women when they were training?
Sensei loved women. Now, not in a kinky sense, just watch it, you guys. He really did. And he said, you know, he said women can wear hakamas from the beginning. They didn't have to wait for Shodan. And he said women understand Aikido in their very nature. There's a greater sort of understanding of harmony and of the sort of principles of Aikido. And no, he loved to train with them when they trained at Hombu. There was some points where he taught groups of women. There were a group of Japanese classical dance teachers that he taught. There's a famous little video of him doing that. And it's interesting because this one with this beautiful video of O Sensei doing quote Aikido with one of the Japanese dance teachers, there was no falling. It was just constantly moving around and redirecting. And there's a wonderful place where O Sensei sticks his hand out and she doesn't know to respond. So he goes, it's like, okay, you're wide open, cover that. But it was a lovely, interactive, loving, and there wasn't a lot of martial stuff. If anybody knows where the video is from, I don't off the top of my head. And I was there when Virginia Mayhew was training. And Virginia, there was recently a long article about her. She sort of co-founded the New York Aikikai, and then she came to Japan. She said, I want to be here for years until I become an Aikido master. And she eventually started the Hong Kong dojo, which was, became a thriving dojo. So anyhow, no, I would say, Sensei didn't have any sense. I never had a sense that he looked down on foreigners. Everybody was a student. Sensei, you've got your hand up.
Hear me?
Yeah, I think you're the one.
Oh, first, let me just say that it's just been a pleasure listening to you, and it's such an honor. And I'm awash with questions, and I kind of wanted to ask about the Aikido and your transpersonal psychology. How do they influence each other? Because I'm hearing so much that's so connected, at least from my perspective of the little that I understand. Our evolvement, those that stay with the art long enough, I'm just constantly watching from the people that I've come into contact with, even when they call themselves the physical side.
Your sound,
time where,
repeat that, your sound died out for a minute.
I'm not sure where it died out, but I was saying, is this better, first of all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I was saying that there are points in time that these people that maybe have stopped with the physical side of their training, but the psychological, the philosophical side of it has not stopped. And I watch them evolve, and there's this base that they operate from. And so I'm kind of wondering how you connect that Aikido philosophy with your trans psychology.
Well, I'll tell you, I owe Sensei ruined me for psychology.
Mm-hmm.
God bless him. Will be forever grateful for that. I could have been, I was a up and coming young social psychologist. My professors loved me, and when I saw Sensei, and I mentioned that there was something inside him that counted, like you could take all his Aikido waza away, and this was still there. That's how I saw it. No, Sensei, just what you're talking about, that people have that other piece.
Mm-hmm.
If they can't do the physical Aikido or choose not to, whatever. And I realized I had read Abraham Maslow. I'd actually heard him talk as a graduate student, and I said, Jesus, this is what he's talking about. He, at the core of his psychology he developed, there's this notion of a person who is self-developed, is mature, is not merely smart or strong or successful, but is, as one would say in Germany, a Mensch. I'm still not sure how to translate that. A real human being. If you grew up in New York, Mensch is a very common term. And I said, that's what I love about him, is that he's a real human being. And I want to study people like that. I want to carry out Maslow's program for what psychology should be, which is to study the best people and try to understand, who they are and how they function. And everything sort of flowed from there. And I, eventually started a university dedicated to transpersonal psychology. Now I've started a publishing company dedicated to transpersonal and psychology and spirituality. My co-founder has 45 years in the publishing business. He's got a MA in theology and basically an MA in psychology. So it all came out of really meeting someone. You know how I put it? I don't know if you remember, Reader's Digest used to have a regular article entitled "The Most Incredible Person I've Ever Met." I used to read those.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to Reader's Digest when I wasn't looking. And you read great stories, and they could be anybody. It could be someone a neighbor. It could be a teacher. It could be anybody. And I said, I've met one of those. I never thought I would, but I've met someone I could write about as the most incredible person I've ever met. And so my interest in transpersonal psychology came from O-sensei, wanting to develop a psychology to talk about O-sensei. I'm not sure I'm any better at it now, 50 years later. Or it's more than 50, I don't know, whatever. So it is all tied together. I mean, I think he really was an example of an extraordinary human being. And you see, I think, Quentin alluded to this. People don't understand who his spiritual teacher was. They really don't know who Deguchi Onisaburo was. You could find out, it's all in English. I mean, I don't have to go back to Japanese to figure it out. He was a poet, he was a potter, he was a painter, he was a calligrapher. He was a medium, sort of. I mean, he wrote one series of books called Tales of the Unseen World, 80 volumes. O-sensei had it in his house in Iwama. His poetry, good translation of his poetry, sounded like Rumi. I mean, that's what a good spiritual poet he was. So unless you understand the dynamics of having a spiritual teacher like that, I don't think you can get O-sensei in terms of that spiritual side of him. I really don't. And I've been lucky. I mean, I've studied with Zen masters and yoga gurus and Hasidic masters, and Christian mystics, and Sufi teachers, and I've loved every one of them. And I know what it's like to say, I will. When I met my Sufi teacher, I said, I will trust my spiritual life to this man.
Quentin, do you mind one more question?
Sure.
Sure.
So I'm listening, I'm hearing you list the different trains of thought that you've gone through, the teachings. We're always hearing that saying about emptying your cup. So every time that you went from one to the other, did you empty the cup completely, or did you take something with you as you learned in the next area?
I took something with me, and my Sufi teacher said, yeah, your past work should not be wasted. So, the empty your cup is a wonderful story dealing with a college professor. Because every college professor needs to learn to empty their cup. It's a horrible profession. Except me. But, I mean, I had that beat out of me on the mat. And on the meditation cushion and whatever. No, I honestly think you have to be able, the process of emptying your cup, first of all, it's like bailing out a boat. You have to keep doing it. You don't toss it away and then there I am. You got to keep that emptying process going.
That strikes
And
me
I-
as something that Aikido teaches us. We kind of step onto the mat and hopefully we empty the cup for that session and see what fills it.
Well, I really think this, the notion of standing on a floating bridge where things are moving, how do you stand and not rush across the bridge? How do you stand balanced? And if the bridge is floating, it's like you can't take a tight stance because you won't keep your balance very well. And I think I've also studied the Book of Five Rings for years, and that final ring, which is nothingness or void. How do we? I think we need to be in that place of emptiness. And Sensei said you have to be in a place of emptiness for takemusu to arise. So yeah, I mean but you have to keep working at it. I emptied my cup 5 years ago, and now I'm, no, you're a guy who emptied his cup 5 years ago and you blew it. Because it's an ongoing practice. I think there's something very profound about, in order to do what Sensei said, takemusu aikido, which is the aikido that's born in that moment of interaction with the world or with another person. You can't say, I know what I'll do. I'll do a riminage if he attacks me or she attacks me, or I'll do this or I'll do that, because that's not acting from emptiness. That's acting from expectation. And I would argue Sensei, if you watch Sensei carefully, he moved freely. He didn't go, I'm going to do this before the encounter started. He sort of stayed open and didn't know what he was going to do until he did it in some sense. And I feel that way once in a while, not as often as I'd like, that, damn, that looked like EQ.
So let me open it up.
Interesting.
Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? And failing that, Bob, I'm going to suggest that you leave us with some final thoughts and the promise that you'll come back.
Okay.
David's got a question.
I promise I'll come back.
Okay, well, we'll let David ask his question.
Okay, David, you got in there.
You got the final one.
Yeah.
It's this idea of recreating yourself, or recreating, what do I write it? Every movement you make, you recreate the world, which is obviously partly in Morihei, but also from Sensei. I wonder if you could give me your thoughts or ideas behind that, or what your thinking is on that.
In my Sufi practice, one of our major spiritual practice is called remembrance. Now, one sense of remembrance is to remember yourself, to be heedful of how you're sitting, how you're standing. But I had a wonderful Sufi teacher who had been a heavyweight wrestling champion in Turkey. And even in his old age, I would never wanted to mess with him. And he said, see, now I distracted myself and I can't remember where I was going. He studied a Gurdjieff system in which you practiced awareness. And he later laughed and he said, gee, if you can be aware of your butt sitting in a chair, so what? I mean, that's nice, but the idea is to remember God, to remember that you're part of the universe, that you're connected with everything that is, and you're connected with that which is intangible, which is transcendent to the universe. And I think that's partly what Sensei meant by standing on the floating bridge of heaven. that how can we remember the intangible as well as the tangible in Aikido? And maybe that's a piece of that sort of friction between the martial and the spiritual. So I think that's one avenue to the spiritual is that sense that we're doing something. We're remembering ourselves, and we're also remembering that which is intangible within us and intangible in our partner and intangible in the universe. And I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. Thank you, Dave.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
So would you like to leave us with a final thought?
That was my final
That
thought.
was your final thought? Then that's good enough for me.
I've run out.
That's not quite true, I suspect, but I'm happy to go with that.
Well, thank you all very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I wish you all the best. Oh, Molly, did you want to say something? You're unmuted.
No, I just wanted to unmute just to honor the fact that you're here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, everybody. Salam alaikum. Peace and blessings to you all.
Yeah. And on behalf of us all, thank you very much for giving us your time and experience and wisdom.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yep.
And I come back.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bob, that was the nicest presentation I've ever heard you do. Is he still on?
No, he's gone, but he might see the recording, Paul.
I've known him. He was the person who started me in Aikido.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Cool.
That was brilliant.
That was fabulous. I really love that.
Rick, we'll see you in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. You now know what you're taking on. Not a tough act to follow, eh?
Hey, I'm not going to try to follow. I'm just going to flow with it. It was good seeing you, sir.
You too. Nice to see you again.
You all take care now.
All right. Bye, everybody. I'm going to close the room now.
Bye.
Bye.